All information presented in this video is sourced from public records, court documents, and verified news reporting. I pulled 3 files tonight. I've been sitting with them for a while now, longer than usual. There's a particular kind of weight that comes with certain files. Not all of them have it. Most cases, you read them, you understand what happened, you move on to the next one. These 3 were different. I kept putting them down and picking them back up, because there's something in all 3 of them that I couldn't make peace with. Not the crimes themselves. I've read enough files to know that human beings are capable of almost anything. That stopped surprising me a long time ago. What I couldn't make peace with was the silence around them. The people who knew. The institutions that looked away. The systems that had every reason to look closer and chose not to. That is what these 3 files have in common. Not just the crimes. The silence. I've opened a lot of files in this archive. Cases that went cold because there was no evidence. Cases that went cold because witnesses wouldn't talk. Cases that went cold because the trail simply ran out. These files are not like that. The evidence existed. The witnesses existed. The trail didn't run out. Someone just decided not to follow it. That is a different kind of cold case. That is a case that was chosen to stay closed. 3 separate cases. 3 different countries. 3 different decades. And the same question running through every single one of them. How? How does a person disappear, completely, entirely, and nobody finds them? Not for years. Not for a decade. Not for 24 years. The answer isn't complicated. It's just uncomfortable. Because in every one of these files, the system had chances to find them. Multiple chances. Documented chances. And in every single one, it didn't. I want you to hold that thought as we go through these files tonight. Not just what happened to these women, but what didn't happen. What should have happened. What could have happened if someone had looked twice. A 20-year-old hitchhiker. 3 young women in Cleveland. An 18-year-old girl locked in a basement by her own father. They were never supposed to be found. That was the plan. Tonight I'm opening all 3 files. My name is the Archivist, and these are the cases they tried to bury. The first file. May 19, 1977, Northern California. A 20-year-old woman named Colleen is hitchhiking to a friend's birthday party. She's careful. She turns down 2 cars before this one. A young couple with a baby in the back seat. They seem safe. She will spend the next 7 years in a wooden box. Cameron Hooker was 23 years old. His wife Janice was 22. They had a baby daughter. They lived in a house in Red Bluff, California, a small, quiet town in the Sacramento Valley. To anyone who looked at them, they were completely ordinary. Colleen was experienced at hitchhiking. She knew the risks. She assessed people before getting in. When she saw a couple with a baby, she made a judgment call. She was wrong. About 30 minutes into the drive, Cameron pulled off the highway onto a remote road. He held a knife to Colleen's throat. He bound her wrists, and then he placed something over her head. A wooden box, homemade, roughly the size of a human head, weighing around 20 pounds. It had been designed specifically for this moment. Colleen later said she thought she was going to die. She didn't die. What happened instead was in many ways worse. The Hookers took Colleen to their home in Red Bluff. In the basement, they had built a wooden box, approximately the size of a coffin, just large enough to lie down in. No light, no sound from the outside world. This would be Colleen's home for up to 23 hours a day. She was released from the box only to be beaten, raped, and forced to do household chores. Cameron referred to her exclusively as Kay, not Colleen. He commanded she call him master. His wife, ma'am. After several months, Cameron coerced Colleen into signing a document. He called it a slave contract. He told her it meant she had surrendered her own free will, that she was now legally his property. But the most powerful tool Cameron used was not the box. It was not the beatings. It was not the contract. It was a story. Cameron told Colleen that she was now a member of an organization called the Company. He told her the company had operatives everywhere, that they monitored her at all times, that if she ever tried to escape or told anyone, they would find her, and they would kill everyone she loved. The company did not exist. It was a complete fabrication. Cameron invented it specifically to control her. And it worked. For 7 years. I need to tell you something about Cameron and Janice Hooker that changes how you understand this case. Colleen Stan was not a random victim. Cameron and Janice Hooker had planned this, deliberately, in advance, together. Cameron had been subjecting Janice to extreme psychological and physical control since the early days of their relationship. He was sadistic, domineering, obsessed with power over other people. Janice had been his primary victim. At some point, they made a deal. Cameron told Janice he wanted a sex slave, a woman he could keep captive and control. Janice agreed, on one condition. Cameron could not have penetrative sex with the captive. In exchange, Janice could have a baby. That was the agreement, a human being's freedom, traded for the right to start a family. They had already tried this once before Colleen. On January 31st, 1976, a year before Colleen was taken, the Hookers picked up a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Marie Elisabeth Spanhake in Chico, California. They drove her to her intended destination. As she was getting out of the car, Cameron grabbed her. He forced her back inside. He took her to the house in Red Bluff. He hung her from her wrists in the basement. He tortured her for an entire day. Then he shot her in the stomach with a pellet gun. And then he strangled her. He buried Marie Elisabeth Spanhake in a shallow grave near Lassen Volcanic National Park. Her body has never been found. At the time, police suspected her boyfriend. The two had argued just before she disappeared. The investigation went nowhere. Nobody looked at the Hookers. 16 months later, they picked up Colleen Stan. They had not stopped. They had simply learned from the first time. Inside the box that Colleen was kept in under the bed, propped up against her purse, was a photograph. A photograph of Marie Elisabeth Spanhake. Cameron Hooker had put it there, so Colleen would see it every time the box was opened. So she would know, without being told, what happened to the woman before her. I need to pause here and tell you the detail of this case that I keep coming back to. After approximately 3 years of captivity, Cameron Hooker began giving Colleen more freedom. He allowed her to jog alone in the mornings. He allowed her to visit her family for holidays. And in May 1984, he allowed her to take a part-time job as a motel maid. She worked under the name Kay Powers. She had a job. She had a name her coworkers knew her by. She had a routine outside the house. She interacted with people every single day. And she went home every night, to the box, under the bed, in the house of the man who had taken her 7 years earlier. She visited her parents for holidays. She sat at their kitchen table. She ate dinner with her family. She answered their questions about her life. And she said nothing. She even sent Cameron Hooker a Father's Day card. A psychologist who later studied this case described what had happened to Colleen's mind this way. If everything you've ever thought in terms of predictability and safety is taken away, what is left of the psyche? This is not a one-time rape or a one-time attack. This was pervasive, for years. The sentencing judge at Cameron Hooker's trial called him the most dangerous psychopath ever encountered. Not most violent, not most brutal, most dangerous. Because Cameron Hooker understood something that most people never think about. That if you break a person's mind completely enough, you don't need chains, you don't need locks, You don't need guards. The prison is already built, and it goes wherever she goes. The reason Colleen Stan was finally freed had nothing to do with police, nothing to do with an investigation, nothing to do with a tip or a lead or a break in the case. It ended because of Janice Hooker. By 1984, Cameron had told Janice something that changed everything. He wanted Colleen as a second wife. He was done hiding it. He wanted to make it official. Janice had tolerated everything up to this point: the torture, the captivity, the years of watching another woman suffer in her own home. But this was too far. Janice also confided in her pastor, who had known something was deeply wrong for years. Her pastor urged her to end it. He told her what was happening in that house was wrong, that she had the power to stop it. In August 1984, Janice Hooker went to Colleen at her workplace. She sat down across from her, and she told her the truth. The company doesn't exist. It never existed. Cameron made it up. There are no operatives. There is no one watching you. You can leave. 7 years. 7 years of absolute psychological control, dissolved in a single conversation at a motel parking lot. Colleen Stan walked out of that job. Janice drove her to a bus station. She bought her a ticket. Before she boarded the bus, Colleen called Cameron Hooker. She told him she was leaving. Cameron Hooker, the man who had terrorized her for 7 years, burst into tears on the phone. She boarded the bus. She went home to her family. And even then, she didn't go to the police. Janice had asked her to give Cameron time to reform, to change. Colleen, after everything, agreed to wait. 3 months passed. Cameron did not reform. He did not change. In November 1984, Janice Hooker finally went to the Red Bluff police. She told them about Colleen Stan. She told them about the box. She told them about the company. She told them about the slave contract. And then she told them about Elisabeth Spanhawk. Cameron Hooker was arrested. He was charged with 8 felony counts: rape, sodomy, kidnapping, and forced oral copulation. He was not charged with the murder of Marie Spanhawk, because her body was never found. And without a body, prosecutors couldn't make the charge stick. He was convicted of all charges related to Colleen Stan in 1985, sentenced to 104 years in prison. Janice received full immunity in exchange for her testimony. As of 2026, Cameron Hooker is still in prison. His parole requests have been denied. Elisabeth Spanhawk has never been found. Her file is still open. Her family is still waiting. Colleen Stan had a job, a phone, visited her own family. She could have walked away at any moment. The company that kept her captive didn't exist. The only thing holding her there was what he had done to her mind. There is a photograph of Elisabeth Spanhawk that was found inside the box with Colleen. Cameron Hooker placed it there deliberately. That detail is in the file. I keep coming back to it. Colleen Stan's case ended because one person finally told the truth. The woman who had helped imprison her was the same woman who set her free. The second file I'm opening tonight is different, because there was no one on the inside to help. No Janice, no pastor, no one who knew the truth. There were 3 women, in a house on a residential street in Cleveland, Ohio, in a city that was actively looking for them, in a neighborhood where police came 1,099 times over 11 years, and not once did anyone open the right door. This is the second file. Cleveland, Ohio, a quiet residential street called Seymour Avenue, a gray 2-story house at number 2207. Between August 2002 and April 2004, 3 young women vanished from the streets of Cleveland, within a few miles of each other, within 2 years of each other. Their names were Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus. For nearly 11 years, they were inside that house on Seymour Avenue, less than 4 miles from where each of them was taken. In a city that put their faces on flyers, in a neighborhood where police responded to calls 1,099 times, in a house that investigators visited at least once. Their captor was a man named Ariel Castro. He was 52 years old when they were found. He had worked as a school bus driver for the Cleveland Metropolitan School District for 22 years. He drove children to school every morning. He attended community vigils for missing girls. He comforted their mothers. And then he drove home, to the house on Seymour Avenue, where 3 women were waiting for him, in chains. The first was Michelle Knight, August 22, 2002. She was 21 years old. She had recently lost custody of her 2-year-old son to the state. That day she had a court appearance scheduled, a custody hearing for her boy. She never made it to the courthouse. Castro had told her his daughter had a puppy to give away. Would she like to come see it? She said yes. He drove her to 2207 Seymour Avenue. He locked her inside. Because Michelle had recently lost custody of her son, investigators assumed she had run away. The search for her was minimal. She was a young woman who had lost her child. In the eyes of the system, she had reason to disappear. That assumption cost her 11 years. The second was Amanda Berry, April 21, 2003. She was 1 day away from her 17th birthday. She had just finished her evening shift at a Burger King near her home. She called her sister before leaving to say she had been offered a ride home. That was the last time anyone heard her voice for a decade. Amanda's mother, Luana Miller, never stopped looking. She appeared on the Montel Williams show in 2004 to plead for information. She told anyone who would listen that her daughter did not run away, that Amanda would never miss her own birthday. Luana Miller died of heart failure in 2006. She never knew what had happened to her daughter. She never knew Amanda was 4 miles away. The third was Gina DeJesus, April 2, 2004. She was 14 years old. She was walking home from school when she stopped at a payphone. She called a friend's mother to ask if they could sleep over that night. The answer was no. She began walking home alone. Ariel Castro knew Gina. His daughter Arlene was one of Gina's closest friends. They had grown up together. She trusted him. He offered her a ride. She got in the car. 3 young women, taken from the same neighborhood, within a 2-mile radius, over 2 years. The city of Cleveland was searching for all 3 of them. Their photos were everywhere. Investigators were working the cases, and none of it led to the gray house on Seymour Avenue. The windows of 2207 Seymour Avenue were covered with boards and plastic bags. No light entered. No light escaped. The women were kept in the basement and upper rooms of the house. They were restrained with chains and ropes. They were subjected to prolonged sexual violence. They were starved. They endured abuse that prosecutors would later describe as sustained psychological torture. Amanda Berry gave birth to a daughter while in captivity. The child, named Jocelyn, was fathered by Ariel Castro through rape. She was born in a plastic paddling pool inside the house. Michelle Knight, despite everything she herself was enduring, helped deliver her. Jocelyn grew up inside that house. It was the only world she had ever known. Castro occasionally took her outside, to the park, to Sunday church services. He told Jocelyn that the chains her mother wore were bracelets. She believed him. She was a child born into captivity. She had no frame of reference for anything different. Castro pleaded guilty to more than 900 charges. Among them, the forced termination of pregnancies. He had beaten Michelle Knight repeatedly during pregnancies. She miscarried 5 times while held captive in that house. 5 times. The charge sheet was 977 pages long. This is the part of this file that I keep returning to. In the years those women were held captive at 2207 Seymour Avenue, police responded to calls on that block 1,099 times. 1,099 times, roughly once every 3 days, for nearly 11 years. 3 days after Michelle Knight vanished in August 2002, police were called to a house 2 doors away from Castro's. Michelle was already inside. In January 2004, officers visited Castro's home directly. This was not about the missing women. This was a child welfare check, after Castro had left a child unattended on his school bus. Child Services requested the visit. Officers went inside the house. They walked through the rooms. They spoke to Castro. They noticed nothing suspicious. They left. Amanda Berry and Michelle Knight were inside that house when those officers visited. In November 2011, a neighbor named Israel Lugo called police. His sister had seen a girl holding a baby, beating on a window, appearing to ask for help. His sister was shaken, terrified by what she had seen. A police cruiser arrived about 30 minutes later. The officer knocked on the front door of 2207 Seymour Avenue, loudly, repeatedly. Nobody answered. The officer got back in the car and left. A neighbor named Elsie Cintron, who lived 3 houses away, said her daughter had seen a naked woman crawling on all fours in Castro's backyard. Her daughter called police. She later told reporters she felt the officers hadn't taken the report seriously. Cleveland police disputed these accounts. They said their record showed only 2 prior visits to the address, and neither was related to suspicious activity. What is not disputed is this. Ariel Castro attended community vigils for Gina DeJesus. He stood in crowds of people who were searching for his victim. He was photographed comforting Gina's mother. A neighbor later recalled standing with Castro the day investigators dug up a yard looking for the girls. Castro told him, "They're not going to find anyone there." He was right, because they were in his house, 4 miles away. May 6, 2013, Ariel Castro left the house. He did not properly secure the door behind him. Amanda Berry found a gap. She pushed. She kicked. She got part of her body through the door. She screamed for help. A neighbor named Charles Ramsey was outside eating a McDonald's. He heard her screaming. He ran over and kicked in the door. Amanda Berry ran out of that house holding her 6-year-old daughter Jocelyn. She ran to a neighbor's home. She called 911. "Help me! I'm Amanda Berry. I've been kidnapped and I've been missing for 10 years and I'm here. I'm free now." Police arrived within minutes. They found Gina DeJesus and Michelle Knight still inside the house. Ariel Castro was arrested later that evening. At his sentencing, Michelle Knight stood up and faced him. She had been held the longest. She had suffered the most miscarriages. She had been the one the system dismissed as a runaway. She looked directly at the man who had taken 11 years of her life, and she said, "I will live on. You will die a little every day." Ariel Castro was sentenced to life in prison plus 1,000 years. No possibility of parole. On September 3, 2013, just 1 month after sentencing, Ariel Castro was found hanged in his prison cell. His death was ruled a suicide. He had served 33 days of his sentence. Michelle Knight was right. He died a little every day. It just didn't take very long. Police were on that block 1,099 times in 11 years. They walked through the house once. In the police report from that 2004 visit, there is a notation, "Sounds from the upper floor," attributed to a television. I've read that report. I'm still reading it. 3 women, 1 house, 11 years. Amanda Berry found a gap in a door that wasn't properly locked. 1 moment of carelessness from her captor, after 11 years of captivity. The third file is different. There was no careless moment. There was no unlocked door. There was no neighbor who called. There was no community vigil. Because the man who built the prison controlled every single variable. He was an electrical engineer. He spent 6 months constructing a soundproofed concrete cellar before he locked anyone inside it. He had thought of everything. Almost. The third file. Amstetten, Austria. 1984. 24 years. I want to be careful with how I open this file. Not because the facts are hard to find. They are fully documented, court-verified, on the public record. But because what Joseph Fritzl did to his daughter Elisabeth is so far outside the comprehension of ordinary human behavior that I find myself pausing every time I come back to this file. Amstetten is a small, unremarkable industrial town in Lower Austria, about 150 kilometers west of Vienna, the kind of town where people know their neighbors, where nothing unusual ever happens. Joseph Fritzl was born in 1935. He grew up in poverty, raised by an abusive mother after his father abandoned the family. He became an electrical engineer. He was respected in his community, successful, reliable, the kind of man people described as a hard worker. He married his wife Rosemary in 1956. They had 7 children together. They owned their home, a nondescript gray apartment block at Ibstrasse 40. What the neighbors didn't know, what Rosemary didn't know, was that Joseph Fritzl had been sexually abusing his daughter Elisabeth since she was 11 years old. For years he had done this inside their family home, while his wife was upstairs, while his other children slept. In 1984, Elisabeth was 18 years old. She had tried to run away from home the previous year. Police had found her and returned her to her parents. Joseph Fritzl had already begun his next plan. For 6 months before August 1984, Joseph Fritzl had been renovating the basement of the family home. He had constructed a hidden cellar behind the main basement. Reinforced concrete walls, multiple locked doors, soundproofed. He had tested it himself, standing inside while his family walked above him. Not a sound escaped. He told the neighbors he was storing valuables down there. Nobody questioned it. On August 28, 1984, Joseph Fritzl asked Elisabeth to help him carry a door into the basement. He was fitting a new door to the cellar entrance. He needed an extra pair of hands. As Elisabeth held the door in place, he fixed it to the hinges. He pressed a cloth soaked in ether over her face. She lost consciousness. When she woke up, she was inside the cellar. The door was locked behind her. The cellar was approximately 55 square meters, about the size of a small apartment. It had no windows, no natural light, artificial lighting that Fritzl controlled from outside. A small kitchen area, a toilet, a sleeping area. The ceiling in places was so low that Elisabeth could not stand upright. Joseph Fritzl went upstairs. He told Rosemary that Elisabeth had left home again, that she had run away. A month later, a letter arrived at the family home. It was in Elisabeth's handwriting. It said she had joined a religious sect, that she wanted to be left alone, that nobody should search for her. The letter was forged. Fritzl had written it himself. He had taken it down to the cellar and forced Elisabeth to copy it out in her own handwriting. Austrian police opened a missing persons file. They read the letter. They accepted it. The investigation was closed. Elisabeth Fritzl, officially, had chosen to disappear. She was 8 feet below the house she had grown up in. Over the next 24 years, Joseph Fritzl returned to the cellar regularly. He subjected Elisabeth to prolonged abuse throughout her captivity. He brought food and supplies. He controlled every aspect of life underground, the lighting, the temperature, the information Elisabeth received about the outside world. Over the course of her captivity, Elisabeth gave birth to 7 children, all of them his. She delivered most of them without medical assistance, without pain medication, without another human being present to help her. One child, an unnamed twin, did not survive. The cellar had insufficient heat and ventilation. Joseph Fritzl removed the infant's body from the cellar. It was never recovered. 6 children survived. 3 of them, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, remained in the cellar with Elisabeth. They had never seen sunlight. They had never breathed outside air. They had never met another human being other than their mother and Joseph Fritzl. The other 3 children, Fritzl left on his own doorstep, in the middle of the night, in cardboard boxes, with forged letters from Elisabeth saying she could not care for them. Rosemary Fritzl found them on the doorstep. She took them in. She raised them as her own. She applied to formally adopt them, and her application was approved by Austrian social services. Social services visited the Fritzl home multiple times. They assessed it as a suitable environment for the children. They found nothing concerning. Rosemary had no idea the children were her own grandchildren. She had no idea her daughter was underground. She had no idea the man she had been married to for decades had built a prison beneath their home. For 24 years, she cooked in the kitchen above that cellar. She slept in the bedroom above that cellar. She raised children who played in the garden above that cellar. And she never knew. While Elisabeth and her children lived underground, Joseph Fritzl lived an entirely ordinary life above them. He went to work. He took holidays. He chatted with neighbors over the fence. He attended local community events. He was known as a responsible property owner, a family man. He also owned a guest house in the Austrian countryside. He rented it out to tourists. He traveled there regularly to manage the property. When Fritzl traveled, the cellar was locked. Elisabeth and the children who lived underground had no way out, no way to call for help, no contact with the outside world. Fritzl later told police he had installed a timed door mechanism, one that would have automatically unlocked if he died or failed to return. I note this detail without comment. The children who grew up underground, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, knew Joseph Fritzl as grandfather. That was how Elisabeth had been instructed to present him. Stefan was born in 1990. He was 18 years old before he ever saw sunlight. Felix was born in 2002, 6 years before they were freed. He was 5 years old when he first breathed outdoor air. 5 years old, and the sky was something he had never seen. In April 2008, Kirsten Fritzl became critically ill in the cellar. She was 19 years old. She had been born underground. She had never been seen by a doctor. Elisabeth begged her father to get Kirsten medical help. For days he refused. Finally, fearing Kirsten would die, he agreed. He carried Kirsten out of the cellar, called an ambulance, told hospital staff that his granddaughter had been left on his doorstep by his troubled runaway daughter. The usual story. But Kirsten's condition was unlike anything the medical team had encountered. She was severely malnourished. She was developmentally affected in ways consistent with years of confinement. Her condition raised questions that the story Fritzl had given them could not answer. The hospital contacted police. Police issued a nationwide appeal in Austria, requesting that the mother of the critically ill girl come forward. A photograph of Kirsten was distributed through national media. Joseph Fritzl watched the appeal on television, in his living room, above the cellar where Elisabeth and her remaining children were locked. He understood that his story was collapsing. On April 26, 2008, Joseph Fritzl opened the cellar door. He brought Elisabeth and her 2 remaining underground children out. He disguised Elisabeth. He drove them to the hospital. He told his wife that Elisabeth had finally decided to come home. At the hospital, police took Elisabeth aside. They sat with her for hours. They promised her she was safe, that she would never have to see her father again, that whatever she told them, she was protected. After hours of careful, patient conversation, Elisabeth Fritzl began to speak. She spoke for a very long time. Joseph Fritzl was arrested that night. He was 73 years old. When investigators entered the cellar at Ebestrasse 40, they found a space that had been lived in for 24 years. Children's drawings on the walls, a small kitchen, a television, through which Elisabeth and her children had watched the outside world without ever being part of it. Stefan, who was 18 when freed, had to be taught how to walk on uneven ground. He had only ever walked on the flat floor of the cellar. Kirsten survived. The children recovered. Slowly, painfully, over years. The trial of Joseph Fritzl began in March 2009. It captivated the world, not just because of what he had done, but because of how long he had done it, and how completely invisible it had been. Elisabeth gave testimony via video link. She was not identified publicly. She was not seen by the press. She was protected as completely as the Austrian legal system could manage. Her testimony was described by those present as devastating, calm, detailed, unshakable. The account of a woman who had survived something unsurvivable and was still standing. On the second day of the trial, after hearing a portion of Elisabeth's testimony, Joseph Fritzl changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to all charges: murder, for the infant twin who had died. Incest, rape, imprisonment, coercion, slavery. He was sentenced to life in a secure psychiatric institution. In October 2025, his lawyers applied for compassionate release. They cited his advanced age and worsening dementia. He was 89 years old. The court denied the application. As of today, Joseph Fritzl remains in that institution. Elisabeth and her children were given new identities, new names, new locations, new lives, protected by the Austrian government. Their whereabouts have never been disclosed, not to the press, not to the public. As far as I can determine, Elisabeth Fritzl is alive, her children are alive, and the world will likely never know their names. That is the one part of this file I am at peace with. The forged letter that closed the Austrian police investigation in 1984 exists on the record. I have read translations of it. It is precise, measured. It sounds nothing like someone who has just been locked in a basement. Austrian investigators accepted it without a follow-up visit, without a welfare check, without any attempt to physically locate the missing person. I want to know the name of the officer who signed off on closing that file. That record exists somewhere. Before I close this archive tonight, I need to open one more file. I told you at the start that I pulled 3 files. That was true. But while I was going through the Fritzl records, I kept finding references to another case. Same country, same decade, same architecture of control. I couldn't put it back in the drawer. So consider this a 4th file, an unplanned one, the kind that finds you, rather than the other way around. While Joseph Fritzl was keeping his daughter underground in Amstetten, in a city less than 150 kilometers away, a 44-year-old communications technician named Wolfgang Priklapil had built his own cellar. The girl he put inside it was 10 years old. Her name was Natascha Kampusch, and she was held there for 3,096 days. This is the 4th file, the one I wasn't supposed to open tonight. March 2nd, 1998, Vienna, Austria. Natascha Kampusch was 10 years old. She had been born on February 17th, 1988. She had turned 10 just 2 weeks earlier. She grew up in the public housing projects on the outskirts of Vienna. Her parents had divorced. Her neighborhood was difficult. She later wrote that she had always dreamed of escaping it, of getting a job, starting her own life, becoming independent. The night before she was taken, her parents had argued. Her mother had forbidden her father from bringing Natascha home from visits anymore. The atmosphere at home was tense. The next morning, March 2nd, Natascha left for school without saying goodbye to either of her parents. She later wrote about that moment. After all, what could happen? It was a 5-minute walk from her home to school. She had made it many times. This was supposed to be another ordinary morning. Several blocks from her home, she noticed a man standing near a white delivery van. He was watching her. She felt uneasy immediately. Something about him was wrong. As she walked past, he seized her by the waist. He threw her into the van. She tried to scream. She couldn't make a sound. Even in those first moments, as terrified as she was, Natascha's survival instincts were already working. She had seen on television that you were supposed to get information about a kidnapper, to keep them talking, to make them see you as a person rather than an object. So this 10-year-old girl, in the back of a stranger's van, terrified, alone, having just been seized off a public street, asked her kidnapper what shoe size he wore. Then she asked him, "Are you going to hurt me?" She was already fighting, with the only weapons she had, her voice, her mind, her presence. She just didn't know yet how long the fight would have to last. That first night in the cellar, Natascha Kampusch asked Wolfgang Priklapil to tuck her into bed, to tell her a good-night story. She even asked him for a good-night kiss. She later explained why. Anything to preserve the illusion of normality. A 10-year-old girl in a concrete room, trying to make something feel normal. Because normal meant safe, and safe meant surviving one more night. Wolfgang Priklapil was 36 years old when he took Natascha. He was a communications technician. He had studied electronics. He was meticulous, methodical, and patient. He lived alone in a house in Strasshof, a quiet residential town about 30 kilometers northeast of Vienna. Neighbors described him as unremarkable, quiet, private, kept to himself. He had no criminal record, no history that anyone had flagged. What nobody knew was that for months before March 2, 1998, Fritzl had been constructing a secret room in his basement. A concrete cell, 5 square meters, accessible only through a hidden hatch in the garage floor, down a set of stairs, through a hollowed-out concrete wall hidden behind a cupboard. He had soundproofed the walls himself. He had installed a concrete door weighing 150 kilograms. He had fitted an electronic locking system that could only be operated from outside. He had connected the door to a detonator, so that if anyone attempted to force it from the outside, a mechanism would trigger and seal the room permanently. He had planned this, for months, in extraordinary detail. The search for Natascha Kampusch began immediately. One witness had seen a young girl being pulled into a white van. They reported it to police. The description of the van led investigators to Fritzl. He owned a white minivan. He was on the list of van owners to be interviewed. Officers came to his house. They knocked on the door. He answered. He was calm, cooperative, believable. They didn't think he looked like the kind of man who would do something like this. They left. Natascha was in the cellar beneath his feet when they knocked. Years later, an Austrian parliamentary commission investigated the police failures in this case. They found that a witness statement describing a man pulling a girl into a white van had been recorded by a police officer in 1998. That statement pointed directly at the area where Fritzl lived. The commission found that statement had been repeatedly ignored. There was also a tip from a caller who specifically named the Strasshof area as a place investigators should look. That tip was not followed up on. Natascha Kampusch said after her escape that she had lost confidence in Austrian justice. I understand why. She was also subjected to a particularly cruel additional injustice during the search. Her mother, Brigitte Cerny, was publicly suspected of involvement in her own daughter's disappearance. Investigators leaked suggestions that the family situation had been troubled. The head of a government commission later made a statement implying that Natascha's time in captivity might have been better than her home life. That statement was denied by Natascha's mother. It was described by Natascha herself as deeply hurtful. While her mother was being publicly accused, Natascha was in a concrete room 30 kilometers away, teaching herself to read faster, counting the days. The cellar at Strasshof was 5 square meters, bare concrete walls, no windows, no natural light. The only ventilation was a small fan, which Natascha later described as filling the room with a constant rattle. She spent the first weeks in complete isolation, no contact with the outside world, no radio, no books, nothing. Just the concrete walls and the sound of the fan. Fritzl controlled everything, what she ate and how much. He kept her in a state of deliberate malnourishment. Controlling her food intake was a way of controlling her body and her energy. A person who is hungry and weak is harder to fight and easier to manage. He was physically violent toward her throughout the captivity. She described periods of being struck repeatedly, injuries so severe that she once heard something crack inside her body. He also chained her to his bed at night. And yet, alongside the violence, there were moments of something different. He brought her books. He gave her a radio. He brought small gifts, mouthwash, scotch tape, things that would seem meaningless to anyone else. Natascha later said she felt grateful for every one of them. Not because she didn't understand what was happening to her, but because in a world where nothing could be taken for granted, a small kindness felt enormous. She read everything he brought her. She educated herself relentlessly. History, science, literature, languages. She taught herself to speak fluent German far beyond her age level. She developed a philosophical framework for understanding her situation, one that allowed her to survive psychologically without losing her sense of self. She later described one coping mechanism that she returned to repeatedly. She would imagine an older version of herself, a grown woman, free, living her own life, reaching back through time to the child in the cellar, telling her to hold on, that she would make it. She was her own rescue, before anyone else came. Over time, Fritzl gave her more access to the house above. She was allowed to cook his meals, to clean his home, to do his laundry. He took her on occasional outings, grocery shopping, always watching her, walking in front of her so he could monitor her every movement. Once, he took her skiing. There is a detail from one of those outings that I keep returning to. At some point during her captivity, while driving to a store, they were stopped at a routine police checkpoint. Officers spoke to Fritzl. They looked in the car. They saw Natascha. And they waved them through. She never said exactly what she felt in that moment, whether she considered calling out, whether she was too afraid, whether Fritzl had warned her what would happen if she tried. What I know is this. Police looked directly at Natascha Kampusch at a routine checkpoint and drove away. I want to spend time on something that is widely misunderstood about this case. When Natascha Kampusch emerged from that cellar in August 2006, she was 18 years old. She had spent almost half her entire life in captivity. She gave her first television interview 2 weeks after her escape. She was articulate, composed, precise in her language. The world did not know how to respond to that. There had been an expectation, an assumption built from how these stories are usually told, that a survivor would emerge broken, incoherent, traumatized beyond the ability to speak. Natascha did not perform the trauma the world had prepared itself to witness, and so they decided something must be wrong with her. She expressed grief over Wolfgang Fritzl's death. She reportedly carried a photograph of his coffin. She lit a candle at his grave. The media called it Stockholm Syndrome. Experts appeared on television to explain what was wrong with her. Commentators speculated about what her composure really meant. Natascha Kampusch rejected every single one of those narratives. She said the term Stockholm Syndrome was disrespectful to her, that it reduced her experience, her 8 years of survival, to a clinical label that told her how she was supposed to feel. She explained her grief this way. Wolfgang Fritzl was the only human being she had consistent contact with for 8 years. In the most distorted and damaged way possible, he was the only relationship she had. He beat her. He starved her. He imprisoned her. He was also the only voice she heard, the only face she saw, the only presence in her world. When that presence disappeared, even a damaged, abusive, imprisoning presence, there was a grief that the word Stockholm Syndrome does not capture. She said, "I have a stamp on my forehead which says victim of violence. I will be ostracized for the rest of my life." She was right about that. The conspiracy theory started almost immediately. People online speculated that she was lying, that she had been complicit in her own captivity, that the whole story was fabricated. In 2013, the Austrian parliament commissioned an independent international investigation, conducted over 9 months with help from the FBI and German investigators. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Wolfgang Fritzl acted alone. There was no accomplice. There was no conspiracy. There was just one man in one concrete room, and one girl who survived 8 years inside it. The world freed Natascha Kampusch from a cellar, and then spent years telling her how she was supposed to feel about it. She refused to accept any of those terms. That refusal, I think, is the most important thing about her. August 23, 2006. 3,096 days after Natascha Kampusch was taken from a Vienna street. She had been watching for a chance to escape for years. Every outing, every errand, every moment outside the cellar. She had been calculating, waiting for the right moment. Fritzl had given her permission to vacuum his car in the driveway. He stood nearby, watching, as he always did. His phone rang. He stepped a few meters away to take the call. The vacuum cleaner was loud. He needed distance from the noise to hear the caller. For the first time in 8 years, Natascha Kampusch was outside, in the open air, and he was not looking at her. She later described the moment she realized this was her chance. I could hardly breathe. I felt solidified, as if my arms and legs were paralyzed. Jumbled images shot through me. She dropped the vacuum cleaner. She walked, then ran, to the garden gate. It was unlocked. She ran through it. She ran through the neighboring gardens. Several neighbors saw her, a frantic young woman running, and were suspicious. Most of them didn't stop to help. She reached the house of an elderly woman. She knocked on the door. The woman answered. Natascha told her who she was. The woman called the police. Wolfgang Pricklepil was informed that Natascha had escaped. He did not run. He did not attempt to flee the country. He called his best friend Ernst Holzapfel. He confessed everything to him. He said he was sorry. A criminologist who later studied this case said he wasn't surprised Pricklepil chose not to flee. He said, Kampusch filled many roles in his fantasy life, from daughter to girlfriend to spouse. In the end, I think he thought he had done everything he could for her, and I really think he felt betrayed. That evening, Wolfgang Pricklepil walked to a railway line outside Vienna. He lay down on the tracks. He waited for a train. He died before police could reach him, before he could face a courtroom, before he could be held accountable for a single one of the 3,096 days. Natascha learned of his death the next morning. She wept. The world judged her for that. She didn't ask for anyone's permission to grieve. She was 18 years old. She had spent 8 of those 18 years in a room the size of a bathroom, and now she was standing in a world that had kept moving without her. She later wrote, "It was over. I was free." 4 words. 8 years. 3,096 days. Natascha Kampusch did not disappear after her escape. She gave her first television interview 2 weeks after being freed. Austria watched in near silence. A country that had given up hope of ever finding her, watching an 18-year-old woman describe 8 years in a concrete room with more composure than most people bring to ordinary conversations. She later hosted her own talk show on Austrian television. She interviewed other survivors of trauma. She became a spokesperson for animal rights. She sponsored charitable projects for vulnerable children. In 2010, she published her memoir. She called it 3,096 Days, the exact number of days she had been held captive. She wrote it because she wanted to tell her own story, in her own words, without intermediaries, without interpreters, without the media deciding what her experience meant. The book was published in more than 40 countries. It was adapted into a film in 2013. And she purchased the house in Strasshof where she had been held captive. People found this disturbing. They asked why she would want to own that house, why she wouldn't want it demolished, why she would want any connection to the place where she had suffered. She answered that question directly. The house is part of my biography, part of my life. I can't just make it disappear. I think about that answer a lot. A woman who spent 8 years in a concrete room, choosing to own the room, not to live in it, not to celebrate it, but to refuse to let anyone else define what it meant, to refuse to let it be erased. Wolfgang Pricklepil spent years trying to make Natascha Kampusch disappear from the world. She survived. She wrote a book. She hosted a television show. She bought his house. And she kept his archive. That is not Stockholm Syndrome. That is a person refusing to be erased. By him, or by anyone else. Wolfgang Pricklepil confessed to his best friend before he died. That conversation has never been fully disclosed publicly. The friend gave a statement to police. The contents of that statement remain sealed. I'm still looking for it. 4 files, 4 cases, 7 years, 11 years, 24 years, 8 years. 42 years of hidden captivity, across 4 countries, across 5 decades. I want to stay with that number for a moment. 42 years. Colleen Stan was taken in 1977. By the time Elisabeth Fritzl was freed in 2008, Colleen had already been out of that box for 24 years. These cases didn't happen at the same time. They overlapped. They ran parallel to each other. While Cameron Hooker was controlling Colleen Stan in Red Bluff, Wolfgang Priklopil was still years away from building his cellar. While Natascha Kampusch was counting days underground in Strasshof, 3 young women in Cleveland were doing the same thing. 42 years. Not sequential. Simultaneous. That is the detail that stays with me most. Every single one of them hidden in plain sight. In houses on ordinary streets in ordinary neighborhoods. In buildings that people drove past every day. And in every single case, the system had a chance to find them. Colleen Stan visited her own family for years while she was captive. She sat at their kitchen table. She answered their questions. And then she went home to the box. Police interviewed Priklopil and decided he didn't look like the kind of man who would do this. They drove away. Natascha was beneath the garage floor. Officers walked through Ariel Castro's house during a welfare check. They heard a sound from upstairs. They attributed it to a television. They left. Austrian investigators received a forged letter from a missing 18-year-old saying she had chosen to disappear. They accepted it. They closed the file. Elisabeth was 8 feet below the house she grew up in. Every time, someone made a decision. A small decision. A routine decision. The kind that gets made dozens of times a day in any investigation. And every one of those small decisions cost someone years. I don't think the people who made those decisions were monsters. I think they were people who looked at a situation and decided it wasn't worth a second look. That is, in some ways, more disturbing than if they had been monsters. Because monsters are rare. But people who don't look closely enough are everywhere. What these 4 women have in common, beyond the captivity, beyond the cruelty, beyond the years, is that every single one of them survived. Not because the system saved them. Not one of them. Colleen Stan walked out because Janice Hooker told her the truth. Amanda Berry ran because a door wasn't properly locked. Elisabeth Fritzl spoke because doctors asked the right question. Natascha Kampusch ran because a phone rang at the right moment. Accidents. Coincidences. Moments of carelessness from their captors. That is what freed them. Not justice. Not investigation. Not the system working the way it was supposed to. I think about what would have happened if those moments hadn't come. If Janice Hooker had stayed silent. If that door had been properly secured. If Kirsten Fritzl hadn't gotten sick. If Priklopil's phone hadn't rung. I think about the files that are still open. The missing persons cases in every city and every country where someone made an assumption and didn't look twice. That is why this archive exists. Not to sensationalize, not to exploit, but because someone has to look twice. Someone has to pull the file back out of the drawer. Someone has to ask the question that didn't get asked the first time. These 4 women asked that question for themselves. For years. Alone. In the dark. The least the rest of us can do is keep asking it for them. Someone has to pull the file back out of the drawer. Someone has to ask the question that didn't get asked the first time. These 4 women asked that question for themselves. For years. Alone. In the dark. The least the rest of us can do is keep asking it for them. Some cases were never meant to be solved. This has been Decades Unsolved. I'll see you in the next file. If these files stayed with you, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Tell me which case you think belongs in this archive. Which file you think has been closed too soon. Which story you think the world has forgotten that shouldn't be forgotten. I read every single comment. Every one. And I want you to know, some of the most important cases in this archive have come directly from people sitting exactly where you are right now. Watching. Remembering. Refusing to let something be buried. If you want to be here when the next file opens, subscribe. It takes 2 seconds. And it means the next time I open a file, you'll be there when it happens. If these cases matter to you, share this video. Send it to someone who needs to hear these stories. Because the more people who know what happened to these women, the harder cases like these are to ignore. The harder they are to bury. The harder it is for systems to look the other way. You being here matters. Your comments matter. Your questions matter. This archive exists because people like you refuse to stop asking. So keep asking. Leave a comment. Subscribe. Share this with someone. And I will see you in the next file.